A Place Called Home by Laurie Wick. Chapter 31. Aren't they a bit tight? Christine stood in front of the full-length mirror in Mac and Julia's bedroom, scrutinizing her jean-encased legs. As she pulled on a boot, Julia answered, "Well, maybe a little, but with no one around to see us, I wouldn't worry about it." Christine shook her head, her voice rueful. "Even if someone does see us, it's better than riding in a skirt." "Oh, I heartily agree. My brother thinks I'm rebellious, but he's never worn a riding habit." "How does Mac feel about pants?" "If I go over to the ranch and back, I can go alone. If not, I have to ride with somebody and stay on McDonald or Cameron Land." Once mounted and ready to go, Julia knew a moment's pricking in her conscience. She knew she had stretched the truth, but she shoved her guilt aside, not wanting to spoil the day. Christine and Julia moved past the McDonald cornfields, ready for the harvest. They rode in silence, taking in the beauty around them. The horses' sturdy legs ate up the acres as the crisp October air surrounded them. The fall days brought cool mornings and brisk nights, but by 10 in the morning the sun was warming things up to a comfortable temperature, and that didn't call for sweaters or coats. Julia pulled her horse atop a small mound, and Christine followed suit. Below them sat the Cameron Ranch. The house was a single-story rectangle, about 100 feet from the stable, a low-ceilinged structure set at the edge of a well-built corral area. Christine's eyes took in the horse barn. It seemed enormous to her. "How many horses do they have?" "I think the 3 that just arrived made it 26. But the stables will hold well over 30. Julia sat still for a spell, letting Christine take in the beauty of the ranch setting. After they turned their horses away, Julia led them down along the creek. They let the animals rest and graze, each woman taking a rock and getting comfortable in the morning sun. "How did you meet Mac?" Christine asked. For the first time in her life, the relationships between men and women weighed heavily on her mind. "He came to the ranch to see my father. Well, actually, it was the first time I'd seen him in many years. He had left home when I was still quite young, but when Mac's dad got sick, he came home to work the farm. I was only 13, but already showing signs of being tall, and Mac was so big and acted so grown up. He was 18 at the time and very kind. He never told me to get lost like Luke and Silas did." Julia laughed softly. "I used to lie awake at night and think about him. Because of his size, I would dream he would come and take me away and then beat up my brothers when they were mean." Christine laughed at this before asking, "When did he first notice you? I mean—" She grew flustered and silent. "You mean as a woman?" At Christine's nod, Julia continued. "The summer I turned 15, I had gone into town one day to shop. Mac was in the store, and we talked. Later, he walked my things out to the wagon for me, and I swear I was head over heels in love. That night, after supper, he came to call. We sat on the porch and laughed and talked for over an hour. By the time he left, I was sure I was in love. After Mac left, my father told me I couldn't see him socially again. I remember crying and crying." "But why, Julia?" Christine's voice was aghast. "Oh, Christine, I'm sorry. I forget sometimes that you weren't raised around here. Mac and his family were not Christians," Julia explained gently, "and the Bible is very clear on its guidelines for a Christian courting or marrying a non-Christian." A week ago, Christine would have been angry at such a statement, but now she realized it was another of God's truths she needed to learn. "I best finish the story. I obeyed my father and told Mac I couldn't see him and why. It nearly broke my heart when he accused me of thinking I was too good for him. I didn't see him again for quite a few months after that, but I prayed every day that he would trust Christ and understand why I had to obey my father. I didn't know until much later that while he had been away, working in the South on a plantation, the plantation owner's daughter used him. She flirted with him and made promises she had no intention of keeping before she up and married another plantation owner's son. She told Mac after the wedding that he would never have been good enough for her. He was very bitter, to say the least. Julia's voice was sad with remembered pain. But he did eventually get saved. Christine broke through her friend's melancholy. Julia beamed at her. Yes, he was saved. About 6 months later, he came to church. He sat in the back and didn't talk to anyone. It went on like that for some time. Then my father did something that surprised us all. He asked Mac to Sunday dinner. After that, the pattern changed. Mac would sit with us, come to dinner after church, and stay until near dusk. It was one of those Sunday afternoons when Mac was over that he and Paul, who was only 13 at the time, were talking on the back porch. Paul went over the plan of salvation with him, prayed with him, and helped lead him to the Lord. It wasn't long after that my father died. I don't know what I would have done without Mac at that time. He was there for all of us. Less than a year later, his own father died. It was a rough time, but we grew closer to God and to each other because of it. Mac asked my grandfather for my hand when I was 17. Grandpa said yes, but that he wanted us to wait until I turned 18. So, we were married in the fall of 1879, 8 years ago this month. Julia's eyes were filled with tears, her wonder at God's goodness not at all dimmed after all these years. Christine, caught up in the miracle of Mac and Julia's courtship, asked, "Do you think, Julia, that God has someone for me?" Her voice was wistful, her eyes also filling with tears. "Oh, Christine, I don't know exactly what God has for you, but I promise it will be wonderful." They embraced, cried, and talked nonstop for the next hour. The sun was high, and Christine's stomach growled, or else they might have been there all day. "Do you plan to expand any time soon, Luke?" "Expand?" Luke's questioning gaze swung to Caroline. "Well, yes. I simply assumed with all this land you would be building more stables and adding to your stock." "Silas and I have no plans at this time to add on," he told her patiently. We're about to our limit as to what we can handle ourselves." "Oh, but you just need to hire some help." She was off again. It was as if she hadn't heard a word he said. Luke was beginning to wonder if the morning would ever end. For being a horseman's daughter, Caroline didn't ride very well. She was too busy trying to keep her riding habit in perfect order. Straighten here, brush off there, and that hat. It was a useless little number that caused her to keep her head at an odd angle in order to ensure that the hat was in the exact place she wanted. They had been out for nearly 2 hours, and as yet Caroline had not stopped talking or giving advice. Luke was getting hungry, and his patience was wearing thin. Caroline was so busy explaining about the way her father had built up with additional stables and help, evidently forgetting Luke had been there, that she failed to notice the 2 other riders moving in the direction of the MacDonald farm. Without conscious thought, Luke adjusted his direction and speed. Caroline innocently followed his lead, talking all the while. "Why, a man from Europe came to see Father's horses. His reputation is flawless, you know." The sound of approaching hooves finally put a halt to Caroline's chatter. "Hello!" Julia called a greeting as the 4 riders came together in a small circle. "You ride in blue jeans?" Caroline's voice was outraged. Undaunted, Julia just smiled and said, "Oh, Caroline, it's unbelievably comfortable, and we didn't expect to see anyone." Julia's eyes took in Caroline's slightly rumpled appearance, her hat a bit askew and rather dusty. Christine only saw the flawlessly made blue riding habit and how it accented Caroline's blonde hair and blue eyes. Luke, on the other hand, had completely forgotten there was a Caroline Chambers. Julia and Christine had raced away from the creek. Julia's pins had held, but Christine's hair, thicker and falling past her waist, had pulled free. It moved with the breeze gently around her face and shoulders. Luke could only stare. Christine at that moment became aware of Luke's perusal. She made an attempt to bring a little control to her hair, but without pins it did little good. She gave up and let it go. Christine felt her cheeks grow warm under his steady regard, even as a tiny feeling of pleasure began to stir within her. Luke sat there, feeling hypocritical. All these years he had objected to Julia in pants on horseback, and here he was, thinking that Christine looked beautiful. In all fairness to Julia, he knew she was careful of where she rode, and often Mac was with her. She and Christine would not have seen anyone today if Luke hadn't maneuvered it. It occurred to Luke just then why Mac never protested to Julia about her riding astride. He liked the way his wife looked in pants. His wife. The words seemed to echo loudly in his ears until Julia spoke. "Have you seen our new niece, Luke?" He smiled. "Last night. Isn't she precious?" "She is that," Luke agreed with her. "What do you think of her, Christine?" "I think she's beautiful." Luke's breath caught at the smile on Christine's face when she thought of the baby. "You were in town last night and didn't stop at the hotel?" Caroline's stringent voice cut through the air like a knife. A brief moment of uncomfortable silence ensued before Julia spoke. "Well, we're starved and headed for home. We'll see you tomorrow." Luke and Caroline watched them ride away. In a rare moment of maturity, Caroline watched Luke as his eyes followed Christine's departure. It became crystal clear just then. Luke Cameron was not the man for her. Never once had he hung on her every word the way the boys back home did. And the look in his eyes when he had seen Christine today? Caroline had to admit to herself that she wouldn't know what to do if Luke ever looked at her with that same intensity. The couple returned to the ranch in silence, Luke feeling regretful. It was never his intent to hurt Caroline. He wished he had known how to handle things better. Caroline, knowing she had made a fool of herself one too many times, also kept silent.